Hello! Today I'm continuing my celebration of Final Fantasy VIII, and having recently discussed the character of Headmaster Cid, it seems appropriate now to consider his romantic counterpart and one-time antagonist of the game, Sorceress Edea. Now, Edea is an interesting character from a narrative and aesthetic perspective, and if you'll forgive me for kicking off with a bit of personal nostalgia from 1999, and the concept art which was widely published to tease the game's initial release, Edea had an immediate visual intrigue, with a blend of femme fatale, almost serpentine mystique, and a delicate, decorative nouveau art style that blended this sense of magical with more organic and plant-like shapes, which reminds me of the famous Parisian theatrical paintings by Alphonse Mucha, and echoes shades of magical villains from other popular media, such as Disney's Maleficent. Indeed, Tetsuya Nomura originally designed her for inclusion in Final Fantasy VII, and in an homage to the more whimsical, organic art style of Yashitaka Amano, which probably accounts quite heavily for how her appearance turned out. And her visual intrigue was duly capitalised upon from the very opening of Final Fantasy VIII, where in the epic opening montage we see Edea featured in various vignettes and cutscenes, fading in translucently over Squall and Cypher's battle in a strangely orgasmic fashion, and walking through walls to hint at these otherworldly abilities that were to come later. Turning to story and character development, Edea is something of a red herring in game events, and just as we're getting into the rhythm of fighting her at the conclusion of each disc, and easing into the idea of her as an arbitrarily ruthless bad guy, player expectations are subverted by Irvine's reveal about Matron in the basketball scene, and Edea's return to normal following the boss battle in Disc 2 threw things into a new and unexpected direction. This traditional build-up of a primary antagonist only to have them bait and switch to another midway through the game isn't something Final Fantasy has traditionally done before, or at least not in quite the same way. For example, Emperor Gestahl in Final Fantasy VI seems like the primary antagonist until he is killed off by Kefka, but Kefka's always been lingering there, in the background, and never really deviates from his menacing characterization that's built up, so he maintains this consistent and logical story arc throughout the game. In similar fashion, we have Ardyn in Final Fantasy XV, who usurps Niflheim as a central antagonist, but likewise he has a degree of consistency because of his moral ambiguity and shady aims throughout the game. So it's not the most unexpected of reveals to have him step up into more obvious villainy later in the game. By contrast, Edea's story arc was a bold move, as it contradicts the popular narrative framework that had come before and since, by having a character we confidently assume as an antagonist, having a complete role reversal halfway through, kind of like the plot device of the false protagonist, but in complete reverse. And where the false protagonist is a character we assume to be a hero early on, such as Sean Bean as 006 in GoldenEye, or Sean Bean as Eddard Stark in Game of Thrones, who either turns into an antagonist or gets killed off, Edea turns this concept on its head, and at the end of Disc 2, without warning and completely out of the blue, she transitions back to this wholesome goodness, becoming another of those what the hell is happening moments, I suppose, that Final Fantasy VIII became renowned for. So, this curveball delivery divided fans, and as I touched on in the introduction to my long-form Final Fantasy VIII review, there were a number of things this game did differently that detracted people, with the bait and switch of Edea to Ultimecia, and the lack of subsequent context offered to Ultimecia being chief among them. For my part, I have thoughts on Ultimecia, and I'll touch on that another time, but I think Edea's story arc is very interesting, and I find her to be an integral character to the story, but owing to the cyclical time loop nature of Final Fantasy VIII, her full significance and impact on the world and events isn't fully realised until the latter stages of the game, and indeed, the closing moments of the game. The entire concept of Cid and the institution of Garden as we know it is predicated on Edea's idea, handed to her past self by our contemporary protagonist Squall, during the time compression events that we witness at the end of the game, and these were later carried out by her husband Cid. So as such, Edea is the driving force behind the cultural paradigm and world affairs that we inhabit and play through in Final Fantasy VIII. Not only through her stint as a president-murdering antagonist while controlled by Ultimecia, but also through founding the mercenary academies that are dotted around the world, which play a major part in political events, and of course our heroes' lives as students. Beyond these macro events, Edea is also closely tied to the party, as the characters we control and work through the game as were at her orphanage as children. And previously known to them as Matron, Edea is one of these conflicted characters that often crops up in Final Fantasy, appearing to be one thing, but then later to be found, quite another entirely, much like Cloud, Terra, and Ardyn from the other titles. Now, beginning at the beginning, and looking at the Sorceress's introduction to the game, and the very concept of the Sorceress, it's introduced suddenly, yet conversationally, to the world and story by Vinza de Ling. Although, it's worth noting that if you look through all the options on Squall's computer at Barlam Garden, in the first 5 minutes of the game in fact, it does explain everything from Sorceresses to Cid, if you are a pedantically inclined player. But regarding story specifically, Vinza de Ling announces the Sorceress as an ambassador during his television broadcast at Timber, and shortly thereafter Edea materialises in person to tempt Cypher over to her, playing on his childhood insecurities and childhood dreams to become a Sorceress's knight. And digressing very slightly on this point, I've long since wondered to what extent Cypher's dream to be a knight resides on this attachment to Matron, because of course his obsession with Laguna's movie, The Sorceress's Knight, accounts for a lot of it, which is why he chose the gunblade as a weapon and adopts the one-handed stance like Laguna. But we should bear in mind that he grew up in an orphanage where Matron was a sorceress, and some maternal attachment there may have provoked him further in this dream because he aspired to protect her. And this echoing of past emotions into adulthood is similarly seen in Squall, whose loss of alone, Big Sis, made him an introverted personality, as I've mentioned previously in my Squall episode. So, Edea's opening gambit is an exciting set piece, establishing Galbadia as antagonists and bringing Cypher over to the other side, which pits him firmly against his rival Squall as a sort of shadow self in a real-world life-or-death scenario. The decision to assassinate Edea comes quickly, and our next interaction with her we can appreciate in hindsight as pure Ultimecia, as she proceeds to denounce Deleng City's populace as filthy wretches and basically telling them that they're all going to suffer. And I think this dialogue is much more telling in what it infers about Ultimecia's background, which is sparsely covered, and I'll get to another day. But regarding Edea specifically, it simply serves to show this extremity of her indiscriminate antagonism and violence that completely polarises with her later reveal as, the kindly Matron. This climactic scenario at the close of Disc 1 also sees a boss fight with Edea that shows Cypher's renewed allegiance kneeling at her side in the first part of a fantastic cutscene. And this is followed by a fantastic FMV sequence showing the Sorceress ruthlessly driving icicles through our protagonist's chest, ending the first disc of the game and inadvertently sparking the eccentricity of the Squall is dead fan theory. Now, what I love during this exchange is that Edea doesn't address the party. In fact, beyond spouting Ultimecia's speech and wooing Cypher, she doesn't really talk much at all, and unlike other Final Fantasies, where we often cut away from the action to see the moustache-twizzling scheming of Kefka, Shinra, Kuja, or whoever, Edea is a mysterious entity whose appeal is mustered primarily through aesthetic and vindictive actions, rather than any obvious plan or dialogue. Which is of course due to the Ultimecia angle, but also I think due to the more figurative and realistic design style that Final Fantasy VIII employed, which really allowed them to convey expressions and action and body language in the FMV and field screens without having to rely on dialogue boxes to explain the situation. For example, when confronting Edea in this sequence that I'm discussing now, we have an excellent cutscene where she wordlessly raises her eyebrows in contempt at the party, which is an excellent example of how Final Fantasy VIII really put its graphical advances to good use and helped craft the idea of this character through actions and body language. So, moving on, following the Disc 2 showdown in Galbadia Garden, Edea's powers transition to Rinoa, and the plot shifts into a new direction, with Rinoa becoming a comatose sorceress, and Ultimecia being revealed as the primary antagonist. We also have Squall's now fully realised feelings for Rinoa, and these take centre stage and becomes the focus of the plot for the remainder of the game, against which everything, including probably the Ultimecia arc, takes a back seat. So as such, Edea's predominance in the events slips away, and though we're treated to a pretty cool segment where we can include her in our party and play as her, her relevance takes a back seat until essentially the end of the game. However, I'd argue that that's certainly not a bad thing, and I think one of the things that Final Fantasy VIII manages beautifully is the pacing of its story. The transition from Edea as antagonist to Squall's character growth through Rinoa, and the steady backstory of the Laguna dreams was brilliantly crafted and delivered across each successive disc. And as I've stated numerous times over the years, it remains one of my favourite games to this day, owing to these qualities and, the structure of its story, which I think is unparalleled in many respects. Now, much like with my discussion of Headmaster Cid, if we consider the short scenes in which we do interact with Edea, we see a character contrasted strongly to her initially evil self, but also her husband as well. She's a very considerate, kind and caring personality, which plays to this idea of her as matron, but she's also determined and driven in many ways in which her husband is not. I think her decision to join the party and venture to Esthar speaks volumes for this, because she has a willingness to be on the front line and achieve things for herself, rather than, for example, hiding in an office when the going gets tough. I'd go so far as to say Edea ranks alongside Tifa, Garnet and Lightning when it comes to selflessness and self-sacrifice, and her willingness to create Cid to destroy her future self speaks volumes as to that. And rather than a red herring antagonist who swiftly becomes irrelevant, I think she's an excellent and understated contribution to the game story, I think. So, wrapping up and turning to the endgame, our final interaction with Edea sees Ultimecia defeated, and in the flux of time compression, Squall arrives at the orphanage to witness Edea receive these powers, and Squall enlightens her on the concept of Cid and future events, and thus the time loop the entirety of the game has operated on is finally fulfilled, and the pseudo-science and weirdness of seeing Squall standing next to his child's self leaves all of our minds blown. But most importantly, we see how the contemporary events that we've just played through begin and end with Edea on the one hand, but also begin and end with Laguna on the other. And again, going back to why I love the structure of this game, it's like two circles that are slightly overlapping, with the game events that we witness taking place in the middle. And one circle is the Laguna story, and the other circle is Edea's story, and they kind of overlap to create this niche of time that we play through, which is just absolutely fantastic. So, there we have it. Edea is a visually striking and intriguing hook for the 8th Final Fantasy game, but far from being some arbitrary evil, she's a quietly significant cog that sets all the game events in motion, and as we've discussed here, was a great inclusion to the story. So what are your thoughts on Sorceress Edea? Drop a comment, start a conversation, and if you like what I'm saying, hit like, hit subscribe to keep updated with my latest posts.